Hello, Moon to Moon. I'm here to do another astrology teaching session. We're going to be looking at the relationship between the sun and the moon in the chart. Before I begin, I just want to name that as I was creating the slides for this, there was a part of me that was like frustrated because I was creating the kinds of slides, and I did create the kinds of slides that I know very well can end up creating frustration and alienation for students of astrology when when it feels like the complexity of who we are is being so reduced. So like deeply reduced down to like a few sentences. And then you're like trying to fit yourself inside of this box. So let's just actually take this as an opportunity to practice what I would invite you to practice anywhere in this world you're wanting to learn astrology, which is like you really have to bring deep trust that it is so much more complex and so much more nuanced than anything that you're possibly ever hearing at once. And that any like lines of information, just run them through your own internal resonance. Notice what feels true and just don't worry about the rest of it. Everything is so relational. Like I love to spotlight a part of the language of astrology, like we're doing here in Moon to Moon, and just like taking one thing, moon, and just like building out and building out and building out and building out and making it this like vast web of synthesis for all kinds of topics. That's so fun. And the moon is part of this whole larger network that is all completely relational and you can't actually separate anything. So in the astrological teachings, we're like breaking things down, but the idea is to invite the many parts of you, all of your different forms of intelligence, to look for connections and look for associations to create relationality between the various things that you're learning in the astrological teachings, like moon sign, moon house, moon aspects to the sun. What does it mean? What it means is going to be very relational and synthetic, and you're going to understand it the more you lean into wanting to understand it. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. I have a slideshow, as previously mentioned. Okay, so every chart that you look at is going to show a picture about the relationship between the sun and the moon at the moment of birth. Because at any moment ever, there's some kind of relationship going on between the sun and the moon. These are the two luminaries, we say, of astrology. They're like the two eyes in our head. In emergence astrology, year one, we have something called a two-eye practice where we practice looking out the eye of the sun and the eye of the moon inside of us through different lenses of perception. It's a really cool, really wild trove of wisdom that we can begin to drop into the more we start allowing ourselves to be many suns and many moons all at once. But we're also born with a chart that has a very specific sun and a very specific moon, and it can be really helpful and interesting to learn about that. So what we're talking about here is a relationship. We're talking about this big, big light part of us, this big, bright illumination energy, this big, bright, like soul spirit self that's come here with this quality that it emanates. It's beaming out into this world. And then we also have this more reflective aspect of us, this more lunar aspect of us that also is very much guiding the human experience of the body and the body's needs, the body's information that we receive for living here. So in this chart, as an example, what we see is a full moon chart because we see the sun opposite the moon. So that's indicating something that we go through every single month, which is a full moon. So the person was born at a full moon when they have sun and moon opposite one another in their chart. For many astrologers, the relationship between the sun and the moon at birth has meaning. It's meaningful. And like all meaning in the chart, this information will be partial and it will be emergent to the moment you're asking questions about it. So, as I've said before, you're never going to know all about this particular thing you're looking at in astrology all at once. You're never going to know the whole meaning of your sun and your moon's relationship all at once. You just learn it along the way as it's talking to you in the moment. So let's think about the sun and the moon together in the chart here. When they're together in the chart, that's like when they're together in the sky, which is a new moon. So if you have the moon and the sun together in your chart, you're moon baby. Now, there's a technical thing here, which is that technically, because the moon is coming up on the sun, if the moon is in an earlier degree than the sun is in your chart, then it didn't quite reach the sun yet when you were born. So you were actually born at the end of the prior lunar cycle. And then within maybe a few hours of your birth, there was a new moon. So if the moon is before the sun by degree, you are technically a dark moon child. Like one of my daughters is 2806 moon and 28 like 26 sun. So it was an exact degree, but technically she's like dark moon baby, not a new moon baby, even though she has a lot of qualities of a new moon person, which I'll say in a second. So that's a technical thing. So a new moon chart would be when the sun and the moon are at the exact same degree, and like the minute of that degree has the moon beyond the sun, after the sun, or exact minute. And then you can also include really up to 45 degrees after the sun's position. So there's 30 degrees in a sign. That will mean that some new moon people have the moon in a sign after the sign of their sun. In general, a lot of astrologers ascribe to the human life that we see in the chart the same qualities that we see in the qualities of the lunar cycle. So this is up for research. Do your own research, look at the data, see what you think. Do new moon people, do you, if you're a new moon person, have like a kind of instinct with innocence, in the sense of, in this lifetime, you're bringing something different than maybe your lineage has seen before. This kind of like new spirit energy. This is up for discussion. I'm not saying you have to believe it, but a lot of astrologers explore this idea. So as I was saying, some new moon charts have sun and moon in the same sign, And some new moon charts have moon in the sign after the sun. My other daughter has this. My other daughter is a moon in Taurus, and then at 8 degrees, and then a 18-degree moon, sun in 8 Taurus, moon in 18 Gemini. So that's 40 degrees apart. So technically she's a new moon baby, although she does have qualities of a waxing crescent, which I'll talk about in a second, because she's sort of in between. There does feel like a quality, like a difference to this relationship, whether they're in the same sign or whether they're in different signs. When when an individual has the sun and the moon in the same sign, there's this kind of quality of a singular perspective, a singular subjectivity that's apparent. I see this in my brother who's sun, moon, Mercury, Aquarius, and then my daughter who's multi-Scorpio, of they're just kind of like there's a clarity of self that feels surprising for those of us who live with sun and moon in different signs. That's most of us. There's this kind of like seeing the world through the same way, seeing the world through the same perspective. When you have the luminaries together, it's just like, this is the way. It's the way of fill in the blank sign, you know? And that sort of like clarity of the subjectivity might be something surprising to the people around them. Now, when there's a different signs, like my other daughter, then there's this sort of tension. There's this interesting dichotomy. There's a unexpected contradiction to selfness that seems to happen, that is a tension that is propelling that person into who they are becoming. Like Taurus and Gemini are very different signs. So that particular daughter of mine, you know, there's like very distinct flavors when you're sensing one sign coming forward than the other, but they're both very important parts of her. So navigating those differences when they kind of are, they kind of don't see each other, because it's difficult for planets in signs next to each other to see each other in the chart. So there's a kind of learning about yourself as a contradictory, interesting person that way, that can be part of your selfhood process over your lifetime, and something that you can learn how to articulate to the people around you. Like, oh, you're now encountering my Taurus. Oh, you're now encountering my Gemini. I know they're very different, but they're all me. So then when the moon starts to pull away from that new moon period, as we've talked about with the lunar phases, we're looking at as a waxing crescent moon, which it can be anywhere. This is not exact, you know, we're making up these phases in order to try to understand something. But it can be anywhere like 45, 75-ish degrees. It's not exact. And in the chart, the moon is moving in a counterclockwise direction, like when thinking about over the course of its pathway. So the moon has pulled away from the sun. This is going to be a few days later. It's going to be like 4 or 5 days later from the new moon is when this person is born. And so the moon is about 2 signs away from the sun now. So we call that angle, that distance, 60 degrees apart, a sextile in astrology. And when we have sextiles, these are times when signs that are in different elements, but they're elements that get along, are in communication. So air and fire make sextiles, and water and earth make sextiles. So this would be the case if your sun, if your moon is two signs after your sun. That's what we're talking about, waxing crescent. Sextiles are sexy. There's sextiles for all relationships between planets. You can have a sextile between your Saturn and your Venus, for example. These are astro words. Take them or toss them if they're confusing. But when we think about sextiles, we're thinking about a dynamic, mutually respecting relationship that propels your life forward in new directions. And this propelling energy is coming from it being the energy after a new moon. So we're waxing. Waxing is getting bigger. It's in the process of growing from the potentiality of all possibilities exist. So this sextile energy is like this sun and this moon, they're not in the same element, but they get each other and they're like, that's sexy what you're doing. Let's propel forward. So if this is what you have in your chart, you can feel into if this feels like kind of like a lifelong signature. If you're born with a first quarter moon, this would mean that the moon is now moved away to more like a 90-degree, anywhere from like 75 to 115, kind of depends on where you want to draw lines, around 3 signs apart from the sun. So we call that a square in astrology. And in the sky, this is when we're looking up at the moon and the moon is in half, more or less, with the light on the right side, if you have a first quarter. A lot of really important people in my life have first quarter moons, I'll just say. Squares, they create this connection between elements, signs and elements that don't really get along. So that would be the ones that the sign doesn't make a sextile with. So for example, water sextiles to earth, which means it squares to air and fire. And there is a way that they understand each other, though. They're of the same modality. Modality is cardinal versus fixed versus mutable, which is something we talked about in the signs video. It depends on, it has to do with where the sign falls in a season. So squares are always happening between signs of the same modality. So they're like a fixed sign will square another fixed sign. So it's like, I get you, you're fixed. But the elements don't get each other as well, because water doesn't get air or fire the way it gets earth, is what we say in the language of astrology. Yeah, for example, my boyfriend has Pisces sun and then moon in Gemini. So that was about a week after the new moon in Pisces. He was born with a first quarter moon. So like very, very mutable person, and has this contradiction between being very air and very water. Squares may feel frustrating to you. If you have one, you may be like, ugh. Or you may be like, thank God I was born with a square, because it's really just a matter of how you perceive yourself. Like how you perceive your life is going to be how you perceive your chart. Which is why I'm interested in unshaming. Because it's hard to look at your chart and be excited about it if you're not excited about yourself or your life. So squares can be frustrating in the sense that it can feel like they're contradicting each other. Because remember, they're also going to be square by house. And so these houses too form squares, where it can feel like they're pulling you in different directions. In your interests, your motivations, what's propelling you forward, what's driving your chariot can feel more contradictory. I said I wanted this, but but my chariot, this other horse is pulling in a different direction. So the squares in our chart, I have tons of squares in my chart. Squares create tension that constantly brings us into deeper wisdom because we're like having to learn how to move with our paradoxes and our contradictions, which actually helps us get into the fullness of ourselves. So I think squares are really exciting things to have in charts, but they might not be some days the parts of you that feel the most easeful. Then the moon pulls even further away. It's starting to get bigger. We're not at a full moon, but we're beyond the first quarter moon. When you're born, then the moon is probably somewhere between 115, 175-ish, 170-ish degrees after the sun. Somewhere 4 to 5 signs away from your sun, likely. So this could mean that your sun and moon form what we call a trine, or it could form an inconjunct. These are very different, actually. Trines are when your sun is in one sign, and that's of one element, and your moon is in a sign of the same element. So this would be like if you're a sun in Cancer and the moon was moving towards a full moon in Capricorn, but it hadn't gotten all the way there. It's a moon in Scorpio. And so sun in Cancer, moon in Scorpio would be a trining sun and moon. And so they both speak the same language, water. This is like this was an added dimension of being like feeling water is like a big part of your expression in this world, what you're doing here in this world. It's just a huge part of your sense of subjectivity and self is this expression of water that you have. But waxing gibbous could also be an inconjunct, which would be the sign after, in this case, Scorpio. Inconjuncts are when anything is 150 degrees apart. So it's between a trine and an opposition, which would be totally opposite. And the funny thing about inconjuncts is really these are not planets that see each other. Like this is not like a classically honored angle between things in the sense that the idea is that there's no sight line. So this would mean that your sun does not see your moon. And so there's this tricksy thing of like having parts of you that don't really see each other and don't necessarily understand why you do what you do. Signs that are inconjunct are like just so different. They're not compatible elements and they're not the same modality. So like Aries, cardinal fire, is inconjunct to Virgo, mutable earth. Like Aries, Virgo, is like very different, you know? However, I personally feel that inconjuncts are so magical. Like I'm obsessed with inconjuncts, actually. It's just that it really needs our consciousness because again, there's no natural sight line. So it's about bringing your own sight to this relationship. So if like you have an Aries sun and you have a Virgo moon, you're reconciling like very different parts of you with very, very different opinions about what's important, about when to act, about what you need to feel safe, about how you want to express yourself, right? Aries, Virgo. So if you have sun and moon in conjunct, one of the most powerful things you can do is create sight lines between these parts of yourselves, unshame their different opinions, these different parts of you, really see them as parts of self that you can like pull out of you and talk to them. Hello, Aries sun. I see what you're interested in. Virgo moon, I'd like to hear your side. and really allow that to be part of like the family conversation. So it's not all happening in your subconscious where you don't really understand why you act in these different ways, you know? Because brought together, Aries and Virgo, that's pretty cool. You can like bring so much power and be caring for the details along the way. But it's like who's in charge when to give it to your Aries and when to give it to your Virgo, right? And I would say this for everyone, for every chart, work with your inconjuncts this way. But if you have sun moon this way, it's just incredibly powerful to think about how you can support your inconjuncts. Okay, so those are going to be the signs on either side of the opposing sign of your sun or moon. Okay. Waxing gibbous. Yeah, it's very exciting energy. This it feels this way in the lunar cycle. You know, when you're past the third quarter and you feel that moon's getting bigger, you know, and it's just like there's this kind of momentum that's in the air with waxing gibbous energy, which may feel to you like it characterizes a lot of your life if that's your signature or someone you know, right? This is, I think, going to have to go over 30 minutes because it's so detailed. A person born with a full moon then is 180 degrees from the sun. And you'd want to include a little bit on the front of that and a little bit after because full moons are not going to be always exact at 180 degrees, exactly opposing. Usually, full moon charts are in the polar sign, the opposing sign of your sun is where your moon is, but not necessarily. Like if you were born at sun at a late degree of your sign, so let's say you were born in late Libra and there was a full moon in Aries, and then like 12 hours later, that moon moves into Taurus. It's still really a full moon. Like if you look up at the sky at night, the day after the full moon, it's still full. It's just not in the peak that it was. Likewise, if you were born at early Libra, sun, and the full moon then was early degree Aries, but you were born with your moon at late Pisces, that moon looked full when you were born, but it's not polar signs. So you're dealing with full moon energy and you're dealing with inconjunct energy at the same time. So welcome to being a contradictory human. That's just how it's going to be. You know, these things are not going to be perfect. That's what's fun about it. So with opposing signs, these are signs that are compatible again, like sextiles. So water's always opposite earth and vice versa. And air is always opposite fire and vice versa. So there's just there's a compatibility there. They're also the same modality, like mutable Pisces water is opposite mutable Pisces Virgo. But they're still not the same elements. So there's a kind of, they're at either ends of this long polarity. That's a massive epic story of a spectrum. So full moon folks see both ends of this polarity. Often it happens that full moon people have parents or caregivers, the main adults around that might have had very distinctly different worldviews and qualities and motivations. And so as a full moon child, you had this like very distinctly different energies that were in your house. And then you grow up being someone who sees the world from both these like big perspectives. Now that might not be the case for your family, but you may resonate with the idea of feeling like you really know the long way of the whole polarity of that energy. And so learning to integrate along that spectrum can become part of your life because you are learning how to compartmentalize like your Pisces moon when your Virgo sun has a job. You know, it's like learning how to get them to talk to each other and like who's going to do what around here. So then the wane, now we're in waning. Waning energy is a different energy than waxing energy. So like at first, one of the first questions that you can begin with is, do I have a waxing moon or a waning moon in my chart? And does that resonate with you? I just deeply resonate with having a waning moon. But so I'm curious for you. What comes up for you when you think about that? So this would be then the moon's peaked around the polar, and now it's coming counterclockwise towards the sun again. So a person born with a waning gibbous moon then has that moon like 170, 75-ish to 115-ish degrees towards the sun, now moving in that counterclockwise direction. So again, now we're going to be repeating the aspects. The aspects are the relationships. Again, we're going to see in conjunct or trine for the waning gibbous. So like same things that we talked about last time in terms of sign relationship between in conjunct or trine. But in this case, there's like a waning energy to the person. So waning gibbous is going to mean different things to different people, but many astrologers feel that there's this kind of disseminating, pollinating aspect to it because it's like post peak of the full moon energy. And this is when we start to be able to even understand like what just happened. And you becomes like a disseminator through your sharing of your wisdom, your sharing of the experience, being someone who is good at the debrief, the debrief after the thing. Then it comes to third quarter, just like earlier we saw the first quarter. Now we're in the waning. Same degrees-ish. It's about a 3-degree difference in sign. So then they're forming a square. So when we're in a lunar cycle, we often associate this time with like when we're realizing from the whole of the lunar cycle we've been living now in, there can be this kind of crisis as we realize we need to release old patterns and ways of being. And that's like the time of like a turn where it's a little bit difficult, but we're coming towards this like really powerful alchemy with the third quarter. And this, if that's your signature, then this is like, that's your life, is like being this change bringer who's like disrupting the old patterns and creating that tension of the square is the part of you that is working with that disruption energy. And then we come to the waning crescent. This is actually my placement. I have exactly 60 degrees apart between my sun and moon. So I have an exact sextile, we say. And this kind of similar to the square, but with less tension, I would say. There's this sense of repatterning, reorienting, mutating that's happening because the old ways are moving out. There's a shedding energy to this. In this case, the sun and the moon are in like a more easeful conversation than the square because it's a sextile. So the two signs are in more compatibility in terms of like getting how the other works. And so they're seeing each other, they're getting each other, they're moving together in this process of mutating and shedding in order to clear out the debris of what's not working. And to me, this does feel like emotional wisdom. Like I feel like this imparts in me emotional wisdom, and also this constant mutating disruption quality that I have as well, where my moon is just at work, repatterning, 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 repatterning. And my son enjoys this because it's a sextile and they support one another as I do that. And finally, the balsamic moon or the dark moon charts. These are the ones where the moon is almost back to the sun. And so you're almost at a new moon, but it's not the new moon. It's the end of the cycle. So this is the moon is anywhere from around 45 degrees to 0 degrees to the sun, including if it's an exact degree, but like my daughter, where the minute has the moon still not quite there yet. And this is a kind of a 12th house-ish kind of placement because this is a life strongly karmic, you could use this word, feeling like the people that you meet, the experiences you're having, there's no coincidences. There's a sense of I've known this in other lifetimes, and like you're bringing closure, you're bringing completion to a lot of what you've carried and known before. That's my cosmology. You may not feel that way about past lives, but there's definitely a deep, deep wisdom to this card to this placement. And it can feel, I know many with this can feel a little out of sync with the world because it's sort of like they're here for these sort of out of time reasons or these like beyond world reasons that want to be respected. It's not like if you have this, like you're not going to like go out and quote unquote accomplish things. You might accomplish amazing things with this placement, but that like the frequency of it may have this deep emotional wisdom, this deep wisdom perspective depth of being a balsamic human being, a dark moon human being. And a lot of things that may matter to people born with other lunation phases may just not matter to you because it doesn't really feel like what you're here for. So who's going to validate that? That's why it can be really helpful to know is just like, oh, I always knew that was true. I can feel amazing. And when I first learned these lunation phases, which I learned from Demetra George's Astrology and the Authentic Self first, and I don't fully resonate with what's there, just FYI, but it's still always worth checking it out and run it through your own filter. I did my math wrong, which is like so classic me. And I thought I was a balsamic baby. And that just, it definitely resonated like big time because I'm also someone who has multiple planets in the 12th house and they're in the last sign of Pisces. So there's something about me that's dark moon anyway. But when I realized like 3-4 years into astrology, of astrology being my whole life, I suddenly realized I had a math error and I realized I was waning crescent. And then I really sat with that and I just wept because it just felt so true to me. And it was very, very meaningful to be seen as waning crescent when I already recognize how dark moon I am. It was almost like, really, one more of those? What about my disrupted stuff. And this just shows how we're complex people. Like you might have a lunation phase that suggests like newness and instincts of innocence, like a new moon. But then you have all these like 12th house placements, or you have all these other types of placements that also indicate like old souls, etc. And they're all true. They're all true. It doesn't mean the contradiction is part of the wholeness. Because astrology invites paradox. And in my opinion, from an emergence astrology opinion, makes it even more interesting and feels more true to me that you can't put people in boxes or give them just like simplistic, reduced labels, just to say, here's your life purpose. We're just living into what feels true to us and weaving it into our experience in an emergent way. So thank you, and thanks for your patience for going over my promised 30 minutes. I hope this was supportive to you.